The Declaration of Independence, one of America's most important founding documents, something that we still look back to even today as a guidebook for how to be. It's not our set of laws, but it is sort of the idea of what all of this great American experiment is built off of. It also happens to be a document that is rife with paradox. It ended up having to be written by somebody who owned slaves, yet it talked about the freedom of all people. It is something that set up these high ideals for America, yet oftentimes we've fallen short of them in our own way. It also is another thing where it talked about everybody's sort of opportunity to get ahead in the world, but in its own sort of way, and its favoritism of property owning ended up benefiting the wealthy more than it benefited anyone else. Some things that are interesting is that the draft that we know now is not the original version. Thomas Jefferson was tasked with writing this document, and over the course of its writing and then going and showing it to everybody else, some changes were made, and some of these changes are particularly interesting, such as an example in which Jefferson had referred to the American states, and then they edited it to change it to colonies. Perhaps the largest change made that's the most notable is the fact that despite the fact that Jefferson himself owned slaves, the original draft of the Declaration of Independence actually condemned the slave trade and said that it was a bad thing and was mad at Britain for continuing to facilitate it as a source of economic growth. But then eventually in the revision process, this aspect of the Declaration was removed because Southern states had spoken out against it. And even, of course, Jefferson himself had much to lose. But yeah, the fact that it did go through an editorial process is an interesting thing. One part of the Declaration that I find to be the most interesting is the passage in which he speaks negatively on the neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. Of course, that territory that he's talking about is what we now call Canada. At this point in time, when the Declaration was written, Quebec had actually been extended all the way south to the Ohio River and west to the Mississippi. So Canada, at that point in time, was a much larger province, a much larger thing to deal with than it is now. But it is sort of interesting to see that at this point in time, now we tend to think of Canada as a relatively benign neighbor who we can have partnership with. But at this point in time, Canada was sort of a symbol of English domination and English control, and the foundling Americans were not fans of this. Another sort of paradox in the Declaration of Independence is the fact that Jefferson got many of his ideas from John Locke, who was an Enlightenment-era philosopher who just so happened to be British. But Locke was a big believer in the role of the individual and how the individual could overcome if only given the opportunity. Jefferson, as a whole, was steeped in British philosophy, and many of these elements of their greater philosophical thought ended up finding their way into this thinking. Jefferson, as a whole, thought that the United States' best future was as a nation of farmers, which, of course, farmers requires land owning. One thing that I think is interesting in regards to this piece is the question of whether it in fact is literature and how you define what is literature and what is not. Well, I think a big thing is that literature is something that hopefully would have beauty to it, but then also be open to interpretation. And I think the Declaration has both of those. There's many elements of it that we can debate, we can consider, what exactly was meant here, and how should we try to, maintain the truth of this document today. But then it also does have beauty, such as in its most famous line. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's pretty good, right? It's pretty good piece of line there. So after that, of course, it goes through a grand listing of monarchical ills, all the things that the British government had done against it. This document in a whole is sort of a precursor of American Romanticism, which was sort of a movement that had started in Britain around the 1790s. So it was a precursor of that as well. But the romantic ideals of individual power, appreciating opportunity, and all of these sort of things were endowed in this document, and then they continue to sort of permeate the culture and saw their ideas sort of come to fruition in the radical individualism of individuals like Emerson, Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. One other change that was made to the Declaration that I think is particularly interesting is that in the original version, the last paragraph reads, "And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And then the revised version reads, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." So, it's exactly the same, save for the addition of the line "with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence." This is a particularly interesting addition because it does show that the idea of God was actually not in the original draft in regards to the conclusion. But then over the course of the revision and editing process, it was actually added in. The protection of divine providence, basically saying that the freedom of the colonies and their liberation from Britain wasn't just a selfish thing, but was something that was actually sanctioned and protected by God. So, in many ways, from its call for freedom for everybody and the other things that it stands for, and its guidance for good government and how to get away from the problems that were proposed by the British, this document stands not just as an exemplary work of statehood, but an exemplary piece of literature and also something for us to continue to strive for.